Welcome to Masters Cast, a conversation. We couldn't be happier to have you along for the ride. Make sure to join us in the comments below. I'm John.
I'm Josh Lioncourt. Welcome to the conversation.
All right, hello, my friends. Today, the conversation is going to be about, I would say we could say this, the two main villains of Masters of the Universe / Princess of Power. Sorry, King Hiss. But that would be Skeletor and Hordak. And before we start, I want to concede one thing, because anyone who's listened to the podcast before knows I'm a very big Hordak fan. Josh would obviously be more of the Skeletor fan. Right? Am I correct in that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a big Skeletor fan.
Okay.
Favorite
So,
villain of all time.
Yeah. So, and I, rank Hordak above him. However, just to get it out there, I concede that yes, even though I like Hordak more, Skeletor is the iconic villain of the franchise. He is way more well-known to the everyday person and, lives on past even Masters of the Universe with like memes and things like that on the internet. So I do concede and agree that Skeletor is, the villain of Masters of the Universe. But I still think it'll be fun to talk about both of them and our, likes and dislikes and what we think. I also wanted to give credit where credit is due. Skeletor was a creation by Mattel, specifically one of their designers, Mark Taylor. And then Hordak, contrary to maybe a casual's belief, and I don't mean casual in a bad way. I'm talking about, kids from the 80s who remember that Hordak was in the He-Man toy line, but he was the villain in the She-Ra cartoon, and there's always been a little bit of animosity where like, oh, She-Ra stole Hordak. But Hordak was developed by both Filmation and Mattel, kind of hand in hand. Dave Capper and Ted Mayer at Mattel, Gerard Fortin and Herb Hazelton at Filmation, and he was always intended to be the main villain for the She-Ra series. So, but I just wanted to give a shout out to those 4 or 5 individuals that made these villains possible for us to talk about today. And since I was long-winded there, why don't you start off, Josh? I would say you could kick it off with Skeletor since he's your bud.
Skeletor, he obviously arrived first on the scene and had many different origin stories in the early days. Is he a demon from another dimension? Is he from some weird planet called Infinita that is apparently some kind of sister planet to Eternia? Is he Keldor originally? Obviously, in more modern incarnations, they have hammered home the Keldor origin. I definitely preferred in the 80s that the Keldor thing was left to you to assume, but not spelled out. I always liked that wherever he was from, it was sort of a mystery, and then we could kind of run with the Keldor idea if we wanted to. But I don't know, do you have an origin of Skeletor that you prefer over others?
I was actually wondering if we were going to approach that subject, and I was thinking about that earlier today. And I was like, do I actually like the aspect of Keldor or not? And I think it depends. I think for the classic 80s Masters of the Universe, so your combined concept of Masters Universe, Princess of Power, putting the 80s one in a bubble, I would prefer, I think, Skeletor to be from another dimension, more of an air of mystery. He did, learn things from the Horde. I like that aspect, obviously. But the whole Keldor thing, it was kind of that throwaway in the mini comic. I don't think for me that has enough traction to say that's kind of the definitive thing. And I feel like it has to be. It was a little weird in the new cartoon with Keldor and how he was used, the whole uncle, thing. I don't know. It's not my favorite, I would say. If I had to pick, I would stick with he's just a demon from another dimension that probably somehow got tied up into the Horde, and that got him to Eternia.
Yeah, for me, I think I like it, at least through the 80s, right? I grew up with all these things, right? The Infinita thing that was in the storybooks, the demon from another dimension, as the sorceress describes him in the Filmation series, the Keldor in the mini comic. I was aware of all these things, and I kind of liked that we weren't sure. Like, it could be any of these, and it's great to have little clues to his past and whatever. But I think the air of mystery is fine. I love that the Keldor aspect exists for speculation. Just like, all the other ones, right? All the other versions were kind of just like, there wasn't enough there to really define where he came from or who he was. And kind of wish they would have left it that way in the newer, basically since the 2002 series. They have really, really hammered on the Keldor stuff. They had it in that series. They had it in the Revolution series. They had it in the CG show that we just had. And it's just like we talked about this on a recent episode with the full panel. It's just taking the mystery out of it and closing off a road for your imagination to latch onto.
I think it's a little on the nose, if that's the phrase to use too, of the whole like, and guess what? The villain is your uncle. Like, he's in your family, like this full circle type thing.
I am your father.
Yeah, like it's, people would probably say the same thing about She-Ra, right? Oh, isn't that a bit on the nose? He now has a twin sister, like type thing. But it is a bit of a retcon, right? Because obviously he was not originally created or intended to be He-Man's uncle. It can bring a lot of dynamic. I liked William Shatner's portrayal of him for sure in Masters Universe Revolution. But that made me think of, do you remember, I can't remember if we actually finished reading all of them, but there was a comic book tie-in for Revolution. And it was a weird backstory of Skeletor.
Yes,
right, where he was, they showed him in the Horde.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was kind of like, but the way they did it, at least the issues I recall, it was still kind of like, but wait, was that actually what happened? Like, he wasn't sure himself. I think that is a more interesting angle.
Yes.
Right? Like, I would love it even if they think he's Keldor, right? Like, there was a Keldor, who died or was killed or disappeared, right? And maybe Hordak convinces Skeletor that he was Keldor, things like that. I think would add to a much more dynamic story than, he's your uncle.
Yep. Which, they've really been hammering that point. Like, I don't even really understand why they've been belaboring that so much in recent media. It's like, isn't it enough to have Skeletor? Like, do we need to have this other dimension of it? I don't know.
They do kind of do that with a lot of the 2002 relaunch stuff, right? Like we still have King Grayskull, we have the Keldor uncle whole situation.
Yeah.
We have
It was when they just,
Despondos. All of that still, they won't give it up.
yeah, it's when they started really saying, okay, we don't want everything to be such a mystery. We want to, I don't know, flesh everything out, I guess. But you do that too much. And I mean, this is kind of right. This is the complaint that a lot of Star Wars fans have about the prequels. It was like, midichlorians being kind of the biggest example, but like there was a lot more questions and mystery around, Vader's backstory and how the Force worked and all these things when you watch the original trilogy, and then the mystery is all kind of sucked out of it in the prequels, and not in a good way.
I do think it worked. If I can put myself back in 2002 when the Mike Young cartoon came out and how exciting it was for a new He-Man piece of media finally for us. And the opening of the movie presentation, right, which was like the first 2 or 3 episodes of the cartoon series on Cartoon Network, we had that whole scene at the Hall of Wisdom and Keldor. And I think that, I don't want to say it blew our minds, right? But it was actually exciting. Like, we never had any type of confirmations really of Keldor. He was mentioned in the mini comic. It was obvious the way he was drawn and portrayed, in the Mike Young show, that you would find out he was Skeletor. And, as a Hordak fan, which we'll get to shortly, the episode Price of Deceit, where we actually see Hordak transforming Keldor into Skeletor, I really, really like, and that was a really well-written episode, I felt, from, I think, Larry DiTilio, actually, which was a writer on the original Filmation cartoon. So I find that it was more exciting then because it was new, whereas now that it's just used all the time, it's because it's not much of a revelation anymore, right? We're like, okay, Keldor.
Well, not only is it not much of a revelation, but I think there is a huge difference between the way Keldor was used in the Mike Young series versus both Revolution and the CG show now, which was in the Mike Young series. How much screen time did they actually spend with Keldor? Like, all told, in the beginning and in the Price of Deceit, I think those are the only 2 times we see Keldor. It's like, what, a minute and a half of screen
Right.
time, maybe total, right?
Yeah, he probably appears for less than 5 minutes in the entire series.
Yeah, and for the rest of the series, he's not even mentioned. It's a non-issue, basically. And so it was done with a lighter touch, right? Whereas Keldor was a major component of the CG show and Revolution as well. Like, we went from, here's a cool little backstory, a little piece of trivia about Skeletor you didn't know unless you were a mini comic reader in the 80s or whatever, that we're going to use it this time, and it's not going to overshadow Skeletor 2. Here's the backstory, and the backstory is going to overshadow our iconic villain.
That's a good point. It does. He is more on the forefront in the newer media, for sure. Maybe not as equal screen time as Skeletor, but he's certainly more integral to plot lines and things like that. He's more present,
especially in the CG show.
Yeah, I think for me, though, in the CGI show, I like the storyline there because of the whole idea of Havoc, like that separate power, and that it was something he was going after and able to obtain. I kind of like that as the origin for that series, because it is different than the Mike Young origin of Keldor. So it's kind of a new spin, whereas Revolution is also different, right, than Mike Young, but Hordak still definitely had a heavy hand in and the transformation of Keldor to Skeletor, just in like a different backdrop, right? So that was kind of just following suit, whereas at least the CGI show for me took a little bit more of a risk, and they did kind of play the whole royal dynamic a bit more as well, because it was more prevalent in the story arc than the quickness of it in Revolution.
Yeah. But okay, so here's another thing. So, what about portrayals in media for Skeletor? We've had a lot of Skeletors. we've got we've got Filmation Skeletor, who is sort of the canonical, iconic version of Skeletor. We had New Adventures. We had Mike Young. We had Revolution. We had CG. And if you want to start, Frank Langella, of course, in the live action film. And if you want to really start getting obscure, there is Skeletor in the Golden Book videotapes and the storybook records from back in the day as well. So we've had a lot of different, mainly voice actors voicing the character Skeletor, and of course animators animating. Maybe who's your favorite version and a runner up?
Awesome. Love this question. And I have a little bit of a complicated answer. Now, I agree with you 100% that the most iconic version of Skeletor is Alan Oppenheimer's portrayal of him in the Filmation cartoons. And not to sound like a Filmation purist, but again, Filmation was the most popular piece of media that Masters of the Universe and Princess of Power will ever see. So that is the one that's in the forefront, and that is the Skeletor that's in memes and things like that today, where kids are sharing them who have no idea who he is. However, while I enjoy Filmation Skeletor, I would say that's not my number one portrayal. I would say my number one portrayal, or should I do my runner-up first? Let me do my runner-up, because I think my runner-up will surprise you a little bit more. My runner-up is the portrayal of him more so in the kid stuff audiobooks / the Golden Book videos, where he's scary in that. He's not like he has a much darker tone, especially in, and I know you love this one too. It was the audio adventure just titled Masters of the Universe.
Yeah, the big LP.
Where they talk about like the vortex and
oh, it's so good.
It's so good. So I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. But it is fantastic audio adventure. I used to listen to that tape all the time. So I would say that's my runner-up, which should lead you to understand why my number one then is actually, I would say, Frank Langella. Frank Langella actually scared me as a child. I was in 1987 when the live-action movie came out. My dad took me to see it opening weekend at Carmike Cinemas, which no longer exists. And in that time in 1987, I would have been like 4.5 years old. And on the big screen, Frank Langella as Skeletor was freaking scary. And the fact that I have an emotional reaction to that, like I can remember being scared. I think he really got what the character would be if Masters of the Universe hadn't started out as a action figure kids property, but if it had started out more so like something like a comic book franchise, like a, you know, if it was like Captain America or X-Men or something. So that's what I'm going to go with. How about you?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question. I totally get what you mean. The storybooks get a little bit complicated because I do agree that the LP portrayal, it's very similar to the Frank Langella one, and uh, I get it for all the reasons
Mm-hmm.
that you're talking about. It's some of them, though, if you've ever listened to The Thief of Castle Grayskull, and they make Skeletor on that one, for some reason, sound like a transformer. I don't understand what they were doing. It's so
I'll have to go
weird.
listen to that one again.
Yeah, he sounds like a robot. It's very strange. So you've got that. You know, we've also got I forgot to mention too. We've got the Skeletor from the Point Dread record, right? Which reminds me a lot of the New Adventures, which is incidentally my least favorite version of Skeletor. I think, although I don't know, the CG show's right up there too. So,
Oh, I love the CGI Skeletor's voice portrayal.
Yeah, not my favorite. I think the adventure still is at the bottom. I think it's so hard because it's so mixed in with nostalgia, right? I think if the live action movie itself had been better, I might have warmer feelings toward Frank Langella. I don't dislike his portrayal, and if they did a movie today, I would love to see a Skeletor like his Skeletor, right? Like that version of for live action. That's the way to do it well. I gotta say though, I think my runner up is Filmation Skeletor with the Mike Young, Brian Dobson, I believe. Is that the right name? I think
Yes.
that's right. As Skeletor, I loved what he did with the character because he pulled from Alan Oppenheimer's portrayal in Filmation and just made him a little darker, a little crazier, a little more menacing, but still very recognizably the same character.
Yeah, it's like he added like a sprinkle of Frank Langella over top of an Alan Oppenheimer type performance.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think those two. It's hard though because like there's so much nostalgia, tied up in the Filmation Skeletor, because he was first, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff. So Skeletor had a mentor, and his mentor is your favorite villain, I believe. So I'm going to let you take it for a little bit, but I do have quite a lot to say about Hordak too.
Oh, of course you do. Of course you do. So when I became, at least to my knowledge, when I became a He-Man and She-Ra fan, notice I say it He-Man and She-Ra, I don't remember a time when there was not She-Ra, Hordak, all of this stuff. I was very young. I was only 1 year old when the He-Man cartoon came out. So I'm not even sure, neither are my parents, at what point the obsession began. But I don't ever remember there not being He-Man, Skeletor, She-Ra, Hordak. So this also may influence my liking of Hordak, because I kind of see him as an equal player to Skeletor on the He-Man series, and I would watch both cartoons back to back on television. So I didn't really see it as, He-Man and Skeletor came first. I saw it as just they all coexisted at the same time. I think the reason Hordak appealed to me more than Skeletor was the technology aspect of the Horde, because I was extremely into tech stuff, like even at an extremely young age. And I know that's like anyone today would be like, yeah, my 1.5-year-old is already playing on an iPad. But back in the 80s, it wasn't typical for such a young child to be using like an Apple IIc type thing. So like I was very into technology. He had the technology. But what was great was it was technology, but he still had magical elements because of his transformations into things. And he was also surrounded by magic people. So I feel like it melded more of my technology and magic love, more so than Skeletor, who was more just magic. So I really feel that that's the main reason I kind of gravitated towards Hordak. It also might have been because more of the Horde toys were available, given the age I was when I was coming into everything, when both He-Man and She-Ra existed. And it was at its, the height really of popularity. So I do think that also influenced me. As an adult, one of the reasons why I still like Hordak is because Hordak is truly evil. I feel like he is a badass, if I may. Whereas there are times I feel when Skeletor can get a bit more wishy-washy in his, evil intent. I just rewatched the Christmas special, and Skeletor is softened by the Christmas spirit. Hordak is not during the special. And I don't know, I feel there were more times in the Filmation show where Skeletor ends up helping the heroes than Hordak helping the rebels or She-Ra. So he just seems to me more like a pure villain, whereas in today's society, they seem to always want to make villains into like anti-heroes, or like they're just misunderstood. I just think like Hordak just wants to like take over the universe or whatever he wants to do, that type thing, whereas Skeletor's motivations might not be as purely just evil as Hordak's are. But other than that, I don't know if I have much of a reasoning as to why, and I certainly don't dislike Skeletor by any means. But with Skeletor, we had a lot of portrayals, like you said. I don't have as much to go off of on Hordak, right? Because the most we know about Hordak is the Filmation She-Ra show. And then he was more of a side villain in the She-Ra and the Princesses of Power cartoon, whereas kind of Catra was the main villain role in that. And he was so briefly in Revolution, and in the Mike Young show, he was, he appeared twice, but once in Shadow.
Yes.
So I just don't have as much, I guess, to draw on. And maybe your theory about mystery and all of that stuff, is he a fallen elder, from, that was always the rumor, is he one of the fallen elders from, the Hall of Wisdom? That's something I would like to see explored. So I still think we got a lot of mystery with Hordak, because I don't pay attention to the stuff that was in the classic toy line bios. Classics, not vintage. I don't pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, I always liked the idea of him being the fallen elder as well.
I think that could be a very dynamic, fun story to explore.
Yeah. Although you do have to sort of disregard a big chunk of Filmation canon if you do that, because of the existence of Horde Prime.
Yeah, I do think Horde Prime lessens Hordak a bit. I have mixed feelings on Horde Prime.
Well, we'll get to him in a second. I want to circle back to something you were talking about a minute ago, which was Hordak's emphasis on technology. And
yes,
one of the things that is interesting about the way Hordak has been portrayed over time is in the Filmation show, I would say he was predominantly a technological villain. That was his technology was his thing, as opposed to Shadow Weaver, his number two, who was or number one, I don't know, his right hand, who was all about the magic, right? And he's been portrayed though in other media, like in the mini comics back in the 80s. He was primarily more of a magic user, wizard user, and he was definitely portrayed that way in the Mike Young show
Yes.
as well. And one thing that, like, in my head canon, that I just sort of came up with myself as a kid, being exposed to both the mini comics and the Filmation show at the time, was that Hordak had been a more of a wizard magic user when he was teaching Skeletor magic, and then something happened, maybe Darth Vader type thing, maybe he got like severely injured, maybe he just became obsessed with technology, maybe something else, who knows, and he gradually became more of the cyborg and lost a lot of his magic along the way. Maybe not all of it, like you mentioned the transformations, although when I was a kid I always thought of those as being still technological, right? Like a transformer. But um but either way, I definitely prefer his more like cyborg type portrayals, because it differentiates him from Skeletor.
Yes.
It makes them very different characters in that way. But it's interesting because if you don't go with the kind of backstory I created as a kid, what the hell was Hordak teaching Skeletor all those years? Skeletor's not particularly adept at technology. He invents some vehicles like his collector, and he's got his little robots and things like that. But like, seriously, like if he didn't start out as the wizard, what was he teaching Skeletor? Because obviously he didn't. He wasn't a very good teacher.
Well, that's why I kind of like the Revolution flashback of that, where he's giving Skeletor like the Havoc staff and stuff. Like it made me feel like Hordak needs people around him to use magic, because he's just doesn't want to deal with it, or thinks it's kind of like, not that it's not
him, maybe.
Yeah, it's like beneath him. That's a perfect way to phrase it. Like like in the Filmation cartoon, he has his right hand woman, Shadow Weaver. She handles the magic stuff.
Right.
But we do know in the Filmation that he was, or at least he used to be, adept in magic, and I think that's possibly how he does his transformations. Visually, they didn't look Transformer, like his hand would glow and then turn into like the blaster and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I do think that it's just more of he saw technology as the way to go. And I do like how they showed that in Revolution. Like it was like, I see potential in Keldor. I'm going to have him, take care of this magic stuff for me. Like he's my minion, type deal. And then of course the teacher is able to, or the pupil is able to overcome the teacher. And that's probably Hordak's own short-sightedness, right? Is that he's so dismissive of magic. It is someone with, powerful in magic that ends up being his demise, right? In the Revolution show.
So we discussed on previous episodes of Masters Cast that we all really enjoyed the She-Ra and the Princesses of Power series from just a few years ago.
Yes.
One aspect of that show, though, that I really disliked was the Hordak as a clone. And we have all these Hordaks. that talk about, Horde Prime diminishing the character. Now, he's basically been demoted to a stormtrooper, essentially, that went rogue or something.
Yeah,
I really
actually.
did not like that storyline.
Yeah, I'm torn. I really, really liked She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, although I do have a criticism that Hordak was not used enough because it was so primarily focused on Catra, which was understandable given the story arc they were doing. I guess in a way, I like that maybe a little bit more. The Filmation Horde Prime confuses me because in the Secret of the Sword, so the first 5 episodes of She-Ra, Hordak is a bit darker. He's not as comedic as he is in most of the other episodes of She-Ra. Like his
Right.
voice performance is even darker in those first 5 episodes. And
Yeah,
there's
his
no
voice
mention.
performance is so much better in the
Yeah. I feel like they lightened him up, right, for the rest of the series after they did the miniseries 5-part. But like there was no mention of Horde Prime, obviously, right, in those five episodes. I always took it more that like, Hordak would have been the head of everything. Then when you find out there's Horde Prime, he just never was fleshed out enough for me to understand why, especially when Hordak is named Hordak. It's called the Evil Horde. Why do we have Horde Prime? I just feel like Hordak should be the head. It didn't make sense in Filmation. In Princesses of Power, I accepted it a little bit more, even though it did dampen down the uniqueness of Hordak. But I did kind of like at least that they did something better with Horde Prime. Like you have Horde Prime, he sends out these Hordaks, and what makes our Hordak unique is he is the one who was able to break away from the Horde, if you will. So I think that's how I accept him more than maybe you do. I still see him as unique because he is the one that breaks free.
Yeah, I mean, I get the point. I just do not like that storyline.
It does counteract what I said about him being purely evil, though, because he's not purely evil at the end of the Princesses of Power.
Yeah, no, yeah, that was not my favorite. There was so much to like in that series. I don't want to turn anybody off from checking it out if they haven't already seen it. It was a very good series, but there are definitely things to critique. But that's true of all of the series. Like,
Oh, yeah.
so the Laughing Dragon, anyone?
But I mean, we haven't had, you had asked, what are the top 2 portrayals of Hordak or of Skeletor? I don't know if we can really say the same for Hordak. He barely spoke in Mike Young. So we really only have the Filmation and Revolution Hordak that actually has had copious amounts of screen time versus the person that did kind of a
He got a
Filmation
fair amount
impersonation.
in Princesses. He did get a fair amount of time.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
he wasn't the
true.
main villain, but he did have, I would say he and Bo were probably like as the male characters that got the most screen time in that series.
Maybe Seahawk.
Seahawk got quite a bit as well,
Yeah.
but I don't think he got as much as Bo and Hordak.
Well,
did.
then what would you rank as your top 2 Hordaks?
Well, for number 1, I don't think there's any question. It's the first 5 episodes / Secret of the Sword portrayal. That's like number 1. There's nothing. There's no other better portrayal of Hordak. I don't think. I don't know if I can even pick a number 2. Really, like he was okay. Like the voice acting for him was okay in the Princesses series. It wasn't bad and it wasn't great. It wasn't terribly memorable. It was just sort of there. I don't know, even though he only got a few lines, I guess maybe The Mike Young would be number 2. He certainly, like, felt badass in Mike Young, in a way that he, I don't think, did so much in Revolution, not at least not in the same way, um, and definitely more so than he did in Princess. So I guess despite how little there is, I guess Mike Young would be my number 2, and number 1 without question is the early interpretation of George DeCenzo for him in the She-Ra series.
Well, sir, not much to argue with there because I actually am picking exactly the same. My runner-up would be the portrayal in the Mike Young show, even though he wasn't like as technologically heavy, which also could just be due to the rights issues at the time that they had to make him strictly based on the toy. In the Mike Young show, you know, he did have gray skin instead of blue skin, all that fun stuff. But in the episode Price of Deceit is just so good when he transforms Keldor into Skeletor and he feels like he is powerful. He may be in another dimension, but he still feels like he is the threat that you better hope never figures out how to get out of that dimension. So I love that. Just the fact that the weight it gives him with such little appearance, right, in that series. And then my number 1, just like you said, is George DeCenzo's performance of Hordak, specifically in the first 5 episodes of She-Ra. And if you go back and rewatch She-Ra, you will understand what we mean. Watch The Secret of the Sword and then watch a random episode of She-Ra, and you'll see a clear difference in the
He's
way
much more
he portrays.
cartoony later.
Pardon?
He's much more cartoony later.
Yes. Yeah. He is villain in The Secret of the Sword.
Yes.
Now I think, or I take it, do you feel that anytime Masters of the Universe, Princess of Power gets rebooted, okay, so whether that's the new movie that's coming up, if they do another cartoon series, anything, do you feel that they always have to go in the same sequence? Meaning, we get Skeletor first, then Hordak would be the next one to show up, like in a sequel or in a season 2, that sort of thing. Is there any world in which it would be advantageous of them to start out with the Horde and not Skeletor?
So I've got a couple of ways I could see answering this.
Okay.
So one is I think you have to start with He-Man and Skeletor. I think you do, just because they are the icons, right? They're the ones that the general public are aware of these characters. So I think you do kind of have to do that. Now you could start earlier in the timeline where Skeletor is a member of the Horde, so that we see him. You know, maybe the initial storyline is him breaking away from the Horde, and you know, the kidnapping of Adora or something along those lines. Start at that point. You could probably do that, and then have the Horde come back into it again later. But to your point about the order, um, I think that the last few attempts at the Masters revivals has struggled in part because they are sticking too slavishly to that, right? It's like, first we have the Skeletor's crew, then we have the Snake Men, then we have the Horde, right? And they keep doing this, and we never get to the Horde, really. Like, we get so little, because everything stalls out at the Snake Men. I don't think the Snake Men are very interesting. I think the most interesting story of the Snake Men, really, I mean, they were decently handled in Mike Young, I would say, but in general, the most interesting stories that have been told with the Snake Men are the defections, right? Like Khan defecting and joining Skeletor's group, and Tongue Lasher and Rattler and stuff joining the Horde in the She-Ra show back in Filmation, and like, and the questions that raises, right? Like as a kid, you know, I had all kinds of, what was the story there? Why did they, you know, stop serving King Hiss or whatever and go join the Horde? Why is Khan over here with Skeletor? That stuff was interesting to think about. And as a group of villains, I don't find the Snakemen very, very compelling, particularly in comparison to Skeletor's crew and the Horde. So, at the very least, I think if they do another run here, just limit or cut out the Snakemen altogether.
I agree. I like King Hiss, but he's definitely, I don't want to say third tier, but I feel just way
No, he
below.
is.
Yeah, way below.
List, I'm sorry. He's at least, if not lower.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, you know, there's just even, I would at this point maybe even rather see like someone like Shakoti or something come back than to do the Snake Men again.
or make the Snake Men, own it that they are the third tier. Like, have them be the group that throws monkey wrenches into battles and things going on between the main groups, right? The Horde and Skeletor's group and the heroes. Like, have them be the wild cards, like, but not primary players, because I just don't think they hold their own.
Yeah.
They just don't.
I do think it's nice they got their time in Mike Young, because we didn't have them in Filmation, but that doesn't mean we need them all the time.
It doesn't mean you need a whole season.
Yeah. I do want to get back to something. I find this could be interesting with Hordak. And correct me if I'm wrong, because if I'm wrong, then this doesn't work. But when you lost your sight, you had already seen what Skeletor looks like visually, but you never have seen visually Hordak, correct?
That is correct. My first exposure to what Hordak looked like was the action figure.
So, given you've never seen Hordak visually, because I feel that would affect the way I would answer this question, how would you describe Hordak, like physically? How would you describe Hordak?
Well, most of it is, like secondhand as far as coloring and stuff goes. I mean, as far as the figure goes and my kind of look at him, I tend to think of him as sort of like, cyborg, so partially tech parts, I guess, like the arm cannon and stuff. And I've always I loved the classics figure where we got him with the arm cannon and stuff like that. That was great. I know he's got a red cape. I know he's got kind of a vampiric appearance, and he's got the bat motif going on, obviously, on his armor and things like that. But like in my mind, he's very much like the mix of human flesh and tech parts, which is probably a little bit off from what he actually looks like, but in my imagination, that's where I take it.
I like that description, actually, because it's a little bit cooler than what he actually looks like. I do think one of the missing parts of the design are the more tech pieces like you're referencing, and that just might be because he wasn't necessarily originally designed to be cyborgy, right? Like, especially the toy design of him. So that's probably why they never fully took it there. But I think that's definitely something they should do when they think about revamps, because in the CGI show, his design is extremely weak, in my opinion. And in Revolution, it's completely boring. So he's just not interesting looking in either of those reincarnations. He's much better looking in Filmation, and he is a bit more technical in Princesses of Power.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. Is like make him that very much play up the cyborg aspect of his character. And I think this might be I hadn't really made this connection before, but I think this might actually be a one piece of why I have such disdain for the New Adventures Skeletor is that it's like, oh, we're gonna make him a cyborg just like Hordak. Like in my mind, that's what it feels like. Like
I actually love that you've brought this up because I never really thought of that. We didn't really talk about New Adventures Skeletor, which I actually like, even though he's your least favorite. Not necessarily that he has eyeballs, but I actually really love the first redesign for New Adventures. Not as much when he becomes in the cartoon. He has the first toy release look for a little bit, and then he's kind of transformed into the Discs of Doom figure look, which I don't like as much. It's not as unique, but that first look that he has, where he does actually have a little bit more of a cyborgy element going on, I think actually would have been an excellent angle they could have used for Skellytech in Revolution. This is a complete missed opportunity, and I'm sad that I did not think about this until now when you brought that up, because Hordak is involved, right, in Revolution when Motherboard comes and he becomes Skellytech. They so should have based the design off the New Adventures of Skeletor look. Damn. Oh, dude. Ah. Now I like Revolution a little bit less, and I was more of a fan of that than Revelation.
I mean, I liked Revolution and all, but I again, I had a similar issue with it though. I think we talked about it when we recorded the show about it as well. It's like Skeletor is the wizard and he uses the magic, and I don't want tech in my Skeletor. That's what Hordak's for. So it just does not work for me. So
I do think they work well though when used together, given that dichotomy, right? If they do keep Hordak on the tech side, Skeletor is on the magic side. I like that they're at odds with their approach to power, and I like that they are villains that are at odds. Like they're not really teaming up together to go conquer He-Man or She-Ra. It doesn't work. They don't like each other. I think that adds to their dynamic as villains, and that they were, teacher and pupil. I love the layers of depth kind of that we oddly got on the two villain characters. And they've carried that out at least through all the other series. He's always been the teacher pupil situation.
Here's something that has occurred to me that you said earlier in the episode. So you were talking about Skeletor having his moments in Filmation where he's more human, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to Hordak, he's like pure evil or whatever.
Yeah, there is an episode of She-Ra where he has to be nice, but yeah, there was more, I feel, elements of that in Skeletor.
Right. But I would argue, set aside for the moment the Christmas special, because I'm sorry, that's not canon as far as I'm concerned. It's a fun thing to watch during the holidays, and I often do most years, but it's goofy and silly, and I don't take it terribly seriously. Like any more seriously than the Christmas Honda commercial with Skeletor in it from 10 years ago.
That was a good commercial.
So, I think some of the, Skeletor having to work with the heroes and things like that, like you were talking about, some of that too may just be a what's the word I'm looking for? A symptom, I guess, a result of the fact that there are Skeletor and Hordak situations are very different. Hordak is in charge on Etheria. He rules it. He controls it. He is not just the big bad of the planet, but he is the government or whatever of Etheria. Skeletor is on the flip side, he is the underdog, right, on Eternia. And so for his own self-preservation, for his own self-interests or whatever, there's more incentive to occasionally cooperate with the with the heroes more than there is for Hordak. So that may be an element to think about as well.
Yeah, I'll take that. That's a fair point. I mean, you did also point out on how, Hordak did take over a planet and everything, and Skeletor has yet to do that with Eternia. But fair point. That does make sense as to why he might have to sway over to the good side a little bit to get himself out of a sticky situation while on Eternia, etc. Or, in the She-Ra episode, Gateway to Trouble, I mean, they don't leave, He-Man doesn't leave Skeletor on Etheria. He lets him walk through the portal back to Eternia and then certainly doesn't arrest him or throw him in jail.
Yeah,
He-Man's too nice for that.
Do they arrest people on Eternia? Because it seems like it's always okay, we defeat you, and now go back to your lair.
Yeah, go back. You can go back to your lair now. We're done. You didn't win.
We'll fight you
sulk
again next week.
Yeah, good exercise.
Something. That's great. I think we have done a good job of covering Skeletor versus Hordak.
I think so. And I think we both might like the opposite character a little more than we thought each other did.
So
that's cool. I was saying, I think that after talking it out, that I feel you like Hordak more than I thought you did. And perhaps you think or realize that I like Skeletor more than I had let on.
Yeah, we take it as a whole. The thing is, you and I grew up with Masters in different ways, because I was there day one, long before there was a She-Ra or a Hordak. You were much too young to remember. I remember the first day I watched the Filmation cartoon, because it had such an impact on me that day. And but as a whole, I did grow up with both. As new elements were introduced, as She-Ra came along, I didn't differentiate between the two as two separate properties. It was all Masters of the Universe as far as I was concerned. And,
right. As it should be, really.
Yes, and I hope in the future going forward here, at some point, some papers can be signed or whatever needs to happen, and we can kind of get a cohesive franchise across the board, because I think so many of the weak spots in, whether it was Mike Young, whether it was the Princesses of Power, or whether it was Revelation or Revolution or whatever, so many of the weak spots have been a result of where do we need to draw these lines between these properties. And I think that lessens the franchise as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we both then are looking forward to how will we receive our next versions of Skeletor and Hordak? And will they improve or just kind of float along that same pattern that we've been seeing? I really hope they take some risks, even if I don't necessarily like it at first. But sometimes you have to take a little bit of risk and break out of that 2002 reboot mold that was created.
Yep. Yeah, we'll see what they do.
Well, and we look forward to reading everyone's comments on Hordak and Skeletor. Thank you for joining us on the conversation, or in the conversation, with the conversation, during the conversation. I'll have to look up the proper grammar for that.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and watching on YouTube.